Good afternoon, everyone, all EdTech friends all over Europe and the world. Welcome to the Brighteye European Virtual Tour, first stopping in the Nordics. And thank you all for being here. We're super excited to host this event. My name is Hege, and I'm the head of community at Brighteye Ventures, where I'm doing my best to support our portfolio company, EdTech companies, including doing events like this, where we can all get together and share knowledge and inspiration and experience. And I really hope you can all hear me. I'm trying to keep on top here. We are very proud and happy to be joined today by Johan in a little bit, co-founder of Kahoot, We Are Human and Entrepreneurship One. And he'll be speaking to our partner, Alex Latsis. But first of all, my colleague Sarah Bertram-Smith will share some of the key findings from our recently launched Brighteye European EdTech Funding Report. So I'll leave the stage to you, Sarah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Hege. So to start off, I'm just going to do a little intro to Brighteye so that all of you can know a little bit more about us and what we invest in. So we are the most active EdTech focused fund in Europe. We invest in 7 to 10 new companies every year at pre-seed, seed and Series A stages. We invest in technologies that, as we say, help people learn and grow. So that is everything from very early childhood years all the way through to lifelong personal growth and development. A core part of our thesis is also to use our team with very diverse network to help companies internationalize, and that could be across countries, cultures, language, and also in the EdTech space, institutional barriers. Now, moving to our funding report, every year we put together an annual report which looks at, I'm going to try and bring it up on the screen actually quickly. Here we are. There we are. So every year we put together an annual report which looks at the trends, progress and prospects for the European EdTech funding landscape. So 2020 really gave us rather a lot to think about. Our full report is available on the website and we shared it across all of our social media channels. So please, I do urge you to download and read the whole thing, but here is going to be a little quick overview of some of our key findings. So to start off with, to set the scene, I suppose, 2020, for all the sadness and disruption that it really brought, it did really generate a systemic shift in the education landscape. The reality is that online learning became the normal for most consumers. And as a result of that, the demand for and awareness of EdTech products grew significantly. Educational institutions, as we all know, have been traditionally analog in their approach, and they truly underwent a radical step change in technological adoption. And this therefore also alerted the potential of this space to various other investors. Now, if we look at this graph, we can see that, you know, funding has really remained resilient. We hit a record year of $711 million invested into European EdTech in 2020. And that growth is a 10x growth since 2014. That's despite incredibly distorted funding patterns due to the pandemic, where we saw more invested in October than the whole of the year combined. EdTech remains a very small proportion of the European total VC investment, but the growth really is resilient and exciting. And we truly believe that the market forces are very favorable and see huge potential for the years to come. So we can see that one of the other key findings is that the share of the pie is really being more evenly distributed. The European EdTech landscape is really expanding. The UK does remain the leading EdTech hub with 40% of the number of deals done and 30% of the value of those deals. But its dominance has really been reduced. And if we look at the Nordics, for example, we can see that although it may seem that they've fallen back in terms of the size of investment. Actually, Nordics hit a record number of $60 million invested into European EdTech in 2020. And that number would have put it just behind France in 2019. And that's regaining all of the ground lost in absolute terms in 2019. This breadth of funding to us can only really be a good thing for the European entrepreneurship landscape generally, as well as EdTech specific. And I feel that as the necessity to be on the ground as such with investors continues to dissipate, this will likely to increase. And that means that the startups that we are looking at, the problems that are being solved, are being increasingly diverse, which is definitely an exciting thing. Also, the investor type is broadening too. We're seeing, we love to see, the EdTech funds distributed across this graph. We've got SparkMind in the Nordics, we've got us in France and the UK. But we're also really encouraged to see people like JME, the second most active early stage EdTech investor in the EU. And this isn't just, anecdotal that we're seeing increased interest from generalist funds. This is definitely shown in the data, and as the potential becomes more obvious in this space, and we feel that this is a trend that's going to continue. This also has a knock-on effect on the amount raised. In 2020, the largest amount raised was Brainly, $81 million. And if you look back to 2016, the largest round was just $16 million. That was DigiSchool. So as we get this increasing interest from generalist VCs and also from private equity players, it's allowing the market to mature. And that is going to hopefully lead to greater paths to liquidity. And that is something we're already seeing. So I think paths to liquidity really have been the thorn in the side of the EdTech space in the past years. And the only traditional buyers of EdTech companies were the large publishing houses. And we're seeing that this is changing fast. In 2020, we saw a new wave of strategic buyers coming in. And on that front, look at Adecco's acquisition of General Assembly, but we're also seeing increasing private equity involvement. And the new crop of EdTech unicorns globally also becoming strategic acquirers. This we've seen happening in India, very notably, and the US, but also here in Europe with Kahoot's acquisition of Drops. Kahoot has also shown us that a European EdTech IPO is possible. And we hope, following Johan's advice and experience, we will see more following in those footsteps going forwards. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. I hope everyone found some insight there. And I also posted a link to where you can all download the whole full report. And then moving on to the big conversation of the afternoon, where we'll let our partner at Brighteye, Alex Latsis, come into the conversation with Johan. And for the audience, please start posting your questions now for Johan and Alex, and we'll towards the end try and reply and answer to as much as we can. And I'll leave the stage to Alex and Johan. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Hege. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks, Sarah, for that great summary. You were perfectly on time. And thank you very much, Johan, for being here with us to answer some of our questions and also the community's questions about your amazing journey at Kahoot, from founder till today. Just to kind of, you all know Kahoot, I'm sure, but Kahoot has followed in the steps of some of the greatest startup stories, both of the Nordics and Europe more generally, really by leveraging playfulness to build unique and world-changing companies. Mojang, Supercell, King, and now Kahoot were all able to use insights into the innate stickiness of play as a powerful tool of engagement to transform the way that we interact with each other and with technology. Obviously, with the announcement of the successful IPO and trading since, Kahoot is not just a beacon for the success of EdTech in Europe, but also one of the great stories of the value created by European tech more broadly. And today, obviously, we're joined by Johan, co-founder of We Are Human and Kahoot, to tell us a bit about his journey from making classroom interactions fun to transforming the way we communicate at work, from startup to successful IPO. So yeah, thanks once again for joining us. We appreciate your time, and I will be asking you a few questions shortly. So, really, the first question that we have is just about Kahoot as a product. The sort of very playful primary interaction with Kahoot is still core to its usage, even though you've grown massively since you initially founded it. How did you first happen upon your human emotion sort of product insight, and how has that had to change as the company scaled?
Yeah, good question. The product is not unlike many things. This is based on the founders, like the collective of founders' experience with education. The good thing for us, we realized, was that most people in the world have gone through education. So we knew that the frustration we were addressing was something that would be adopted to many people. So that's actually, if you're then thinking, am I starting a company? Am I starting something that can scale? We already were thinking early on, this is worth looking at, because we had a technology that was also solving interaction. So when we started out, we were really looking at how do we engage people when we are a lot of people grouped together, and learning was one of the frustrations we addressed. So it was important to look at from Kahoot perspective from this. It's just, we came from a kind of general trying to solve engagement when large groups are together. And one of the things we want to solve there was how do we co-learn? And then where we ended up going was figuring out that co-learning was the big opportunity, because it's homogeneous and there's an economy around it. When we started, 10% of the education market was private in terms of revenue. So we were like, okay, this will change. This is an opportunity. What can we do? So the initial thing that we looked at was, how do you get the classroom to do one thing together collectively? And we used game theory and game-based technology for that. So we basically used the network of the internet, and we used the structure of games. And then we adopted it to a behavior that most schools need, and that's formative assessment. Basically asking questions, getting the data back to the teacher. So doing live data in the classroom, where people were trying to solve it with very advanced models. And we realized the best you can do is actually get the live data from the student to the teacher, but then they portray it to everyone, because it's good pedagogy. So if you look at the emotion we're trying to do, it was just basically trying to make something quite difficult very engaging and informative, just like you do with games. Oops, I can't hear you, Alex.
I'm sorry. Relatively new to hop in. Is there something that has had to change after you reached a certain scale, or would you say the product is still pretty much at its core the same product as you started out with?
Yes and no. So yes, the basic format is the same, because we didn't invent the format of quizzing. So we just took something that already was a very established game. It was about 70 years old, I think, as a formal game. And we addressed another quite normal thing, formative assessment, but it was coming in. But what we did early on, so the product has changed to address the same thing. The format is the same, but what has changed, of course, is what worked 10 years ago, which then was, we were like the first digital product to scale. Of course, that is not relevant anymore. So yeah, the basic product is still there, but it has moved miles. One of them, which is the classic thing also if you want to build a big company, is you have to leave your early adopters behind. You have to build a product for the masses. So what excited the early adopters early on, just the fact they can use it, whatever, that was not good enough when you were trying to scale it. So the onboarding part of the product is very, very different. So if you're looking at the whole product suite, not just what people thinking about Kahoot as playing, a big part of Kahoot, a defining thing of it is the creator, where you're making the content. Our business model, everything comes actually out of that part. That one has gone from a novelty that was just get people going to becoming quite advanced. So yeah, the base idea is the same, but the product has massively transformed as you're leaving the early adopters behind and addressing more of the mass market need, which at that point would have been total overkill if you'd done it early on.
Great. And I have a sort of another product-related question, which is sort of a bit of a sideline. But do you think that your background, which yours and Jamie's background, which is more product-focused, helped you to build such a malleable product in a sense?
Yeah, I think what's unique about Kahoot, and I think most success stories, that you have a very diverse team, right? You have a star technologist. You have we had the pleasure of a professor who's a gaming expert. He teaches games. So you have that one, and then you have Jamie and I, who had experience with product and brand. So very much our job in the past was working with large international brands, BBC, MTV, Mercedes. So I think for us, was unique for Kahoot at that time is we had a very, very deep focus on building, call it human-driven products.
Great, thank you. And I mean, so this is sort of slightly related to the product's evolution, but one of the key milestones of development or evolution of a startup is when you sort of find product market fit and you're able to start monetizing. So I've heard you say that you noticed many similarities between the classroom and the boardroom, and that a key insight was that was a key insight in turning Kahoot into sort of revenue generating business. Can you tell us a little bit more about that insight, and whether you think you could have reached the same milestones just solely keeping your focus on the education sector?
Yeah, no, definitely. And of course, the interesting thing is I haven't been part of the management of the phase now, which really is capitalizing and monetizing. But the plans, you have to think of it from day one. So the question you're asking me is, the reason we chose to build the product, address the market, and go for it was because we from day one realized that one of the insights we were bringing from our background, particularly as we had worked with corporate gaming and education, was that it's the same things that happen in the boardroom as in the classroom. So the important thing was develop such a simple model that we very easily knew that we could turn the product into corporate world later. So our original hypothesis was that we're going to build an EdTech product that can address the whole market, that can flex at home, in offices, and there, because at that time that was the only way to have a business really. But what we realized was that we could build the momentum, the brand, and the position within the homogeneous market of the classroom, and it's also where we were willing to kind of sacrifice everything, but at least we were bringing something meaningful. And then at one point, the big debate in the company was, at what point do we start monetizing our corporate users? Because our terms and conditions meant they could use it, but they were supposed to pay, but we hadn't turned on there was no functions to pay. So it said you have to pay, but there was no way of doing it. And the turning point was when we started putting in the payment stuff, because then you have to change the culture of the business. You have to actually change a lot internally. So the big thing for us was to see how big does the machine need to be, and how long do we run a freemium culture towards the pay culture. And that was a big shift in the company. And I think most people I speak to, is one of the hardest thing you do, is when you start turning on the revenue part of it, because everything changes. So I would say that when we early on were choosing between revenue and none, we have a beautiful slide on it, because we literally had it up in the boardroom with an advisor in Silicon Valley, and he asked us, what do you want to do? Well, we said, we know what we want to do. But we had to have both of them. And we knew one thing would have revenue, but it wouldn't be scalable. The reason I can say that, you had Quizlet, who were already in the market, having revenue, saying they're never going to raise money. So it's kind of, okay, if the competitor already is doing the other thing, we're doing this thing. So it was a very, very clear choice to take. And also, by the way, if you then ask the background we had with Martin, me and Jamie particularly, we knew how to build products that has adoption with users. We didn't know much about how to monetize. So it was also, choose where you're strong. Our path was on that side. So nonchalant, we thought we can turn on the revenue later. But I don't think you could have built a company the way Kahoot is if you had done the other way, or I'm convinced you couldn't have.
No, for sure. I mean, I suppose you've covered some of this, but if you could just speak a little bit more about the journey, really, from startup to where you are today, and obviously, I understanding that you're less involved in the day-to-day, but still involved in some very deep ways, and kind of what help did you really value along the way, whether it was from investors, new management, advisors? And now that you have all these resources to hand, how do you see Kahoot as a company managing those resources and sort of continuing to develop thanks to those resources?
Yeah, I think the pleasure of being early stage startup is that you're much more productive per employee and pound spent than you are later on, right? There was a big shift in the company after I left, where of course everyone was frustrated because your output per pound spent was much lower, and how long before that picks up again. And one of the reasons Microsoft won't invest in you is because they look at your backend team and going, how the hell can you have so many users in such a small backend team? But they didn't know that the CTO was sleeping with a Fitbit, and so something is how long. It's not the thing of the advantage of the startup is that you have the fresh energy, you have all the reasons to fight hard, and you can do it for a short. You can sprint and you can be all these things, but you need to know when you turn into kind of a long distance racer, and you have to use your advantage as a small one, right? I think what is impressive with the management of Kahoot now is that they have been extremely focused on actually delivering on what still is the core, not being tempted to develop a billion features. It's much more feature rich, but they're not doing a billion different things. They've been very true to the original thing, and focusing the massive resources they have now on that. Understanding the brand. I think very early on, where you can make what a startup can do when you don't have a brand, you're building it, something that works for you. That's an advantage, is having a brand that works for you, and you're spreading it, and users are spreading it for you because you're the new kid on the block, and they have a love and they want to be seen with a new thing. So what we early on realized was this idea of using your users, as an integral part of your business. You're not your users; they are your company, and you have to kind of extend your mindset to include them and how you empower them to be your business. Of course, as Kahoot gets bigger, it's so big now. You can't have the same relationship with all your users, right? So there's a shift there, and it's another thing also that I've been thinking a lot about. The advantage of kind of disorganized startup that you have to go into be organized later on is you always lose some of that magic in the collaboration between the insights of the different divisions, from designers to the social media team to support and so on. And I think one of the things that I advise everyone is to try and be much better at that, still that cross fertilization of the company as you're growing bigger, because that's what we addressed when we created Kahoot. We saw that the big publishers, which really was our competitors, they weren't talking to each other. They had different products, but they weren't integrated. And another part is Kahoot also have to kind of realize now that what worked 10 years ago doesn't work anymore. Like, everyone can do what we did 10 years ago now in a shorter period of time. So I'm not sure if that answered your question.
It does. I mean, I suppose if and I understand this isn't necessarily your purview at the moment, but in terms of sort of using the brand and the platform of Kahoot to sort of expand and develop, using your current resources, like how do you think the culture of Kahoot is going to, we briefly mentioned an acquisition that happened earlier, and how do you kind of see that brand sort of acting as a platform for sort of add-ons or for acquisitions or anything that could sort of lead to more inorganic growth that might be beneficial to you?
Yeah, no, that's good. That's a question I like, because it's something that I was passionate about from day one. Is one of the reasons, Eilert, who now heads up the company, one of the reasons he joined is because he's an expert on this, and he believed that same thing as us very early on when, let's say, nobody else did. It was really him and the founders who believed in the strategy that we were going to build a brand that could buy others. So even when we had 300 users, we were building a brand that we thought at one point would be a brand that we could use as an advantage to buy others, that we would have an unfair advantage. Now you can say that because that's what we're doing, right? The price, the share price of Kahoot is also based a lot on the brand and the future promise, which means we can use that as an asset. They can use that to go and buy other companies at an advantage. But early on, we did the same thing, which so building a brand that we basically figure is very good for employment and users and so on, but it's also very important that other companies want to sit alongside you. So an early test of building the brand was, who wants to collaborate with us? What pool do we have on collaboration? Because that's an early test of acquisition. It's the collaboration side of it. So being very methodical about building a brand as an unfair advantage and an asset in a company was very early important for us. And then literally then starting to figure out, okay, and early on you start approaching companies and you act a bit like you could buy them just to see. And now that's one of the most important assets the company has. It's the future promise of the brand, and you want to be part of it. And of course, now the exchange rate of the shares of Kahoot versus the companies is massive in the favor of Kahoot. So much more than revenue and other things. So I would say if you want to build a modern company where position and brand is a thing, Kahoot is a good example.
Great, that's really helpful, I think, for lots of people here. We're a European fund. You're a very successful European startup. Is there anything unique about the European startup as a species? And the sort of bigger question is how do we, as European startups, conquer the world?
Yeah, no, definitely. What I think is unique about us Europeans is that we, particularly if you're looking at education, is that we actually have an empathy for the global education system, whereas say the Americans are on this one, they have a blind spot. They pretty much only see themselves. So we saw that very early on, discussion we had about, are we relocating to the US or not? But it was an advantage to be a British, Norwegian, Nordic startup was that we have very much of big empathy towards the global education system, and we can make more of a global company from a pedagogical and curriculum and so on point of view. But we also realized very early on that is in the US you scale. So we also, as a Europeans, we thought we have to be as good as Americans on the consumer side and getting into the American market and building a consumer first product. But at the same time, as an EdTech, where we're, that's a split, you then have an empathy for the global educational market, understanding how particularly the British system is how it goes out in the world. So we use like the way we get into expats, around the world through that, and you grow into the system. So understanding what tentacles you can build. And I think as Europeans, we luckily that's a forte we have. And also I think as Europeans on that one, you have that forte and have an empathy for it. A lot of the reason Kahoot worked is because of timing. It's not just because we were so smart or whatever. It was just that we were lucky to sit with the knowledge at the right time. And we're in the right point in time to do that. And I think that's the other part of having an understanding. So with education startups, I think, or learning startups, is that if you're looking global, you can also start looking at what is the right timing to do certain things. Kahoot 10 years ago, it worked then. You couldn't do it again now because it's a different market, right? So you can't look at Kahoot and copy it. But a unique thing that, you can kind of get the best from the Americans, but you can still go global quickly.
Just to sort of dive deeper into that question a little bit, I mean, the thing that we've noticed as investors is that typically countries with smaller populations are forced to look at internationalization from day one. That's definitely a characteristic of Nordic startups. It's a characteristic of, I mean, myself, I have a Greek background. Greek startups, very similar. It's a very nascent scene, but there are companies that have already grown spectacularly and been very successful. And there's this sort of push, to go from use your market as a testing ground and immediately go to a huge market like China or the US or wherever else it is. Do you think that is an advantage over startups that are founded in larger economies like Germany or France or the UK, for example?
Yeah, I would say, actually, I don't. I would say that we like to talk about this way. I think it's much a disadvantage. I meet too many Nordic companies who can't grow out of Nordics. So they have great products, but they stay small. We never hear about them, right? We only hear about those who've gone out and used it as an advantage. I think as much as advantage, some people I meet, they also get a disadvantage. They're so optimized for the local model. And this comes from my previous background as well, where we looked at selling program as what's it called, apps and stuff, was that in Norway, for example, the payability, the level of what you can sell app for in App Store is so high. It's a great test market. People are quick to buy and you can have a very high margin, but actually completely faults you in unit economics when you're going out to the world. So we see it again and again and again, and people have an unrealistic idea what they, for example, can go to the global pricing market and get shocked when they have to have a different one, but forgetting maybe that volume and so on. So that's one part of it. So I think if you have the insight and understand that you want to go global and so on, yeah, you can use it to advantage, but you have to actually be very good at looking at the markets you're going into and what is the, what are the drivers there that are very different to ones you have locally. So we were lucky in Kahoot because we were split between the UK and the US. Sorry, the UK and Norway. So we got into our fingers to see the difference. And then trying to figure out what is the scalability of things. So for example, we didn't crack Germany for a long time because Germany, we thought it was one market, but in EdTech, it is, it's a minefield of lots of small things, and they're completely different places. So we're like, actually, Germany is the worst place, but America is the best place because every state except Texas follows exactly the same thing, and there are 300 million people. So, and teachers actually have spending power, unlike in Norway, where there's so this advantage you're asking about is like, it's only an advantage if you open your mind and are willing to understand the market you want to launch into.
Okay. And as you sort of slightly answered this, but for everyone here, as European startups, how do we, okay, if we have the right insights at the right time, timing is great and everything. How do we compete with our US counterparts, who right off the bat raise, 2 times the amount of funding and higher valuations with very experienced venture capital funds? I suppose we've spoken a little bit about the unfair advantage, but what key advice would you give to people in Europe trying to conquer the world?
Yeah, and I'm not doing this to big you guys up, but actually, and it was actually one in Geniality who said this to me. Like, he doesn't want to be a small fish in a big fund's pond, which is what you often can be in the US. You get initial so on, but actually not every story is straight. So actually having good venture capital or partners with you is super important. And here in Europe, because the funds on LearnTech is smaller and so on, there's an advantage there. And also, actually, the product of Geniality is a good example because they understand a global trend of communication is core for education and so on. And we understand in Europe, we're good at this. They understand in the US, but because they're sitting outside and the advice they're getting is instead of people thinking, oh yeah, but they're doing it, they're doing it. Over here, it's a bit like people are a bit more. You can get a bit more backing, or maybe on what is a good idea, even though we have good big competitors outside. And I didn't expect this, but actually, the fact that Google was Kahoot's one of the biggest competitors, that was a validator that made actually more European funds also more comfortable investing. So if faster conquering the world is it's all about storytelling again. It's like understanding and stacking it up. It's actually quite hard, I think, in the US to also go big because you have so many doing the same thing. We are fewer of us doing it, so it's less competition in that sense. But I'll go back to Geniality. Like I love them as an example, just because they're doing something that you would think they're an American product, but they're adding and they're building it. You wouldn't know where they're located. Like they're actually Spanish first and so on, but they're not doing this thing of trying to be uniquely from that one country. They're just building something that, because it's a global product, people think it's US. Unfortunately, the way it is. Same with Kahoot. So that's an insight that I think people forget, is actually build the product so it just feels global.
Great. No, I think that's great. And I mean, I suppose there's, that's a very good piece of advice for EdTech entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs more generally in Europe. But is there anything specific? Is there anything specific about founding an EdTech startup? Is there any piece of advice that you would give to EdTech startups that might be watching today or might listen to this in the future that's specific to EdTech?
Well, yeah, it's one thing that's definitely specific to EdTech is we call it the good genes. Is that because you're addressing a problem in society that is often funded by the government and seen as government and the society's job, and you're trying to do something good for society. People have much more time for you in many ways. People want you to succeed because you're solving a problem anyone can identify with. So actually, it's actually quite easy to be a good company in EdTech versus other places, and actually using that to your advantage. And also means that people have a lot of time for you, for insights, for testing. And the biggest thing with EdTech is that it's so homogeneously around the world. it's the format of education is so similar, no matter where you go in the world, that you can scale so quickly. And my biggest frustration I see with a lot of them is people are making things unscalable. And if you want to survive in EdTech, where you have low payability, but you have a large mass, you have to address large mass. Unless you're doing, of course, a specialty software for a special aid or something. But actually, the way we look at it is actually special aid is actually, that's one of the best places to scale, because you're addressing a special need that most people have, just people have a higher weighting of it. I think I said it before, I do believe the next billion-dollar companies are going to come more often in a learning than other places, because it's an unaddressed big homogeneous market.
Great. And I mean, we really thank you for all of your questions, all of your answers today. We've actually finished a little bit ahead of schedule, and I'd like to give some extra time, an extra 3 minutes to the community to ask some questions here. So we have one that's just come up, which is I think it's sort of just been addressed. It's from Danelius. Johan, do you feel that now you know the recipe for creating a successful EdTech company, or was it just hard work and luck? You've addressed much of this, but obviously...
it's very dangerous to think because you've had a success that you don't the answers. I wouldn't say I have much more insights now into the market, and it's much easier for me to identify things and so on. But maybe having the counterintuitive idea, it might be more difficult now because I'm more ingrained. Like when we came in, our advantage was that we were bringing gaming and comms and corporate learning and things into a space. So basically that was the advantage, or we had the counterintuitive advantage. In many ways now we are so deep into it. So when I wanted to start investing into EdTech, I was actually more interested in looking outside the box again to see companies doing different things. So I would say the danger here is that you'll repeat your old habits, and they're no longer valid, really. If you look at Kahoot's product, it's a 10-year-old product. So you couldn't launch this now, but it's big because of its mass. So I guess the point is, I know how to make a product in 2010 and scaling it, but that's not relevant in 2020. But we're probably quite good at playing balls with people and getting people to see the counterintuitive part of it.
Okay, great, thank you. And we have another question from Sari in Finland. Again, you've addressed part of this, but maybe a similar question from Henrik in Denmark. It's just about the freemium model, and you sort of suggested earlier that this is quite key to your early success, and it was quite a deliberate decision. The general question is, how much do you think freemium contributed to your long-term success, adopting it early on?
And this is now relevant to when we launched. At the time we did this, it was essential. And I genuinely, it's very easy to look at Kahoot to say that if we hadn't gone freemium, then you wouldn't see where we are now. Because once we chose freemium, we built the whole company around freemium. We went all in, right? That's also on freemium. You build a different brand. You build a different presence in the market. You do completely different things. So we basically, the success is because we chose to do the best we could with freemium. So it's kind of, it was after that first initial thing, when we addressed the market, it wasn't a question anymore. The thing when we look a lot at this now when we speak to companies now, the willingness to pay and the ability to pay and everything is very changed now. So having a revenue now and having a hybrid model now, you can get to that much earlier. Kahoot is still a freemium product now with a pay model, right? So what I would say now is the market now is very different to then. So now I would say if I were to do it again, I would be as eager to kind of address revenue early on. But maybe the conclusion I see now is probably the hybrid is the best now. Now you can easily, without too much taxonomy, actually do parallel.
Using freemium potentially as a funnel for your paid model.
Yeah, so using freemium to, and again, it's so varied, but I would say, if you're looking at the space I'm often interested in, using freemium to build presence, community, UGC, all those things, that's where freemium is very good. But then if you're addressing, collaboration issues, you're addressing kind of the more administrative side of the business, you can go in and you can do premium. And that's normally where people, when you're asking freemium and so on, is you're addressing what at that point is nice to have, and your job is to make it must have, right? That's the whole idea of a freemium model. So going social first is important. So if you're addressing a company now and you don't need the masses, you don't need the social first approach. But I think now you can actually go attack both sides at the same time. Yeah.
Great, and I've got a question which is related to your comment on social here, from Ingrid in Oslo. Hi, Johan. Do you think the networking effects that worked in 2010 are still relevant today? Which network effect mechanisms would you use if you built a new company today? Would you change anything about that?
Yeah, I know why she's asking this, because I'm an investor in Ludenso that she represents. So hi, Ingrid. And I've been feeding them with this stuff. Yes, NFX, of course, I guess you know them. Investment company that that have network effects as their backbone. So yes, the network effects of 2010 are relevant now because they're actually human behavior, and they were relevant even before the internet. It's just that the channels of where they took place was different. What a lot of people are missing out on is when they, for example, want to copy the Dropbox model of innovations and free space and so on, is they're forgetting that some of the biggest networks effects are person to person, outside of the untrackable networks effects which happen between people. And really, what I'm trying to get people to work on when they're doing network effect is to your end of the day, all online digital network effects end of the day is fueling the biggest one, which is the kind of the human to human one, which also happens inside your brain without thinking about it. So all the strategies and stuff, they're so relevant now because of human behavior. But of course, you have different tools. Like TikTok is. I didn't have TikTok back then. If Kahoot had TikTok at that point and we weren't relying on YouTube, we could be so much more rapid. We could do so many more things because TikTok actually represents very much the Kahoot game feeling. So of course we would design and do things differently and to exploit TikTok, which is one of the very premium social first products at the moment. Like Spotify's unsocial compared to TikTok. Yet both are dealing with music.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. We have a question specifically about the sort of the Nordic style here from Froda. Excuse me if I'm mispronouncing your name. Your design is very different from a Nordic style or the digital styles of modern Western sites and apps catering to young audiences. Was this also a global decision? What has influenced the design?
Yeah, awesome question for us to get. One of the things we spent a lot of time on was to make sure that we designed for the user, not for ourselves. So we kept on saying to designers ourselves, we're not designing for our portfolio or our own image. We need to design for the user that we want to reach. When we locked in on American K-12, we designed for the teacher who lives in Middle America and shops at Walmart. So if you look at Kahoot's product, it needed to be something that looked like a part of that classroom and you could pick it up in Walmart, not something that you would pick off the high street in Paris. Because then the teacher's choice would be, it's not for me. So one of the biggest problems we saw, and this goes still in EdTech, is that there's a barrier. It's not for me. They're scared of using it, blah, blah, blah. And also that was a barrier for us to be used in companies and in universities. But we quite quickly really realized that was more at the administrator and teacher level than actually the students, because they just enjoyed the game. So yes, that was a global decision, and that's why it's designed as a Fisher-Price toy. And it looks like a lot of other things, because sometimes that's what you need. But then I think everyone also saw what we did, that you never missed that you played Kahoot. It was, now you don't see it anymore, but in the beginning it was Kahoot everywhere, animations, logos. I mean, it was part of the game. You just knew you were Kahooting. So we completely branded you with the experience, and that was also part of that happened at a level where you identified with it. It's me. It's where I stand. So, and then over time it got more sophisticated. So we kind of worked across the boardroom to the classroom. We call this the Pixar strategy. And if you're interested, I know Frode is a designer. So what you pick up on is to understand that you're basically designing to the now of the young. you're making a new experience. For the older, you're designing for their memories. So if you listen to the music our Finger created, it has Monkey Island and it has Nintendo stuff. And then it has what's called modern beats that you can overlay with modern pop songs. And then you meet in the middle, and the same with the design in the game. So you basically, you create a new moment between the new experience and the memory experience. And this is like some of the core kind of behavioral things we design into Kahoot, where we're very proud because we think it's quite sophisticated, and we learned that from Apple, Mercedes, Porsche, Steve Jobs, Pixar, all that generations of people, and we can still copy that.
That's great. Now that you say the Fisher-Price-like design, I can't unsee it. That's great. Monica from Lithuania has a question as to whether you have any regrets or missed opportunities that still hurt. That's a bit of a touchy one, but yeah.
Yeah, Jesus, we made so many mistakes. I mean, and particularly because we are, uneducated in that. I'm an arts student at the end of the day, right? I run tech companies, and you're running into like formal education space. And can you imagine how many feet we tramped on and what we did wrong? A big one, I would say, is that early on, I did not understand the dynamics of the boardroom. I was actually, when running the company, we also wanted to revolutionize the way we run the company. So we created a unique culture between us that made us move fast and rigidly. And we had a very decentralized, the way we people were empowered and so on. But it made it very difficult with the boardroom, who's normally is used to a very different way of setting and doing things. And I was not sensitive, and I was completely untrained to be, having that quick success. So my regret is definitely not tuning more into the board and the professionals in the board, even though I disagreed with them. Dismissing is not a good strategy. So that still hurts because I'm almost embarrassed to look back at my behavior. But hey, there we are.
Great. I think that's obviously, as someone who is frequently on boards, I'm glad that you're advocating for listening to board members. So a question from Azi Jamalian. So it's really a question around whether targeting school and education and home consumer markets is a good strategy, or it's better to focus on one or the other.
Yeah, that's a cool question, because it's not a, I'll address it because this is something we addressed a lot in Kahoot. So this comes down to how you choose to make your product. A little back to Frode question. So we decided that at that time we launched into education, very few tools felt like your social media tools. Things didn't look like Facebook and Twitter and Google and so on. They looked ugly and chunky, and they were designed by an administrator. So one of our premium things was that we're going to bring the modern world into the classroom, and just by that we will get acceptance from the students. And then we're going to bring gaming in, that the acceptance and all the behaviors that they're doing, all the behaviors they have at home. So we decided that for success for Kahoot is that it needs to be as much fun to play on a party as in the classroom. If we can bring the party to the classroom, we have won. If we in the middle can address the gatekeeper, the teacher, and they can see this has pedagogical value. So from a design and pedagogical point of view, we addressed the home market to make sure the product was acceptable. And we in Norway, for example, peaked on New Year's Eve. We peak on all these things. Same in the US now. We peak on party time. But and we had this idea that we'll flex the brand in social, but we addressed the actual business, everything else. We addressed pedagogically, we addressed everything for the classroom and learning, but we very much wanted to make sure that the product could also exist comfortably in the consumer market. But actually going after the consumer market, monetizing it is a very different way, and we chose to leave that for later. That's actually coming in now because it's very, 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 very different. But actually, we bought a company that I invested in early on that called Poyo, which actually is addressing home learning, and which is completely different. You can't actually, you almost like the Kahoot users are not using home learning. So, but they sit well together because they're filling in a big umbrella. So I would say you have to pick your monetization markets, but definitely let your product comfortably kind of flex outside of its core place, because then you have more opportunity to grow.
Great, and I think we have time for one more question, which is from Thomas Horsted, When did you decide to move from away from communicating Kahoot from a product perspective, so as a teacher assessment tool, to Kahoot from a sort of behavior change perspective, in other words, making learning awesome? And how do you believe that has been integral to your branding and success?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's not when we changed, it's when we choose to say what when. We early on, our launch strategy was actually making that, asking great questions is the reason to having great learning. We also had making learning awesome then, but at that time when we went into the market, down to the Google search words, we had to do a thing we didn't want to do. We had to actually have clickers and student response system. We had to address where the need was, what they were asking. So you have to kind of make a product that you have to be willing to talk to them at where they are, even though that's not where you want to be. That was hard for us because we didn't want to be associated with clickers and so on. We realized, no, we need to actually address the market and talk about being a student response system and so on and so on. But the second you do that, you also parallel starting to seed these other things. So we from day one talked about being a value-based company. We from day on talked about inclusive design. We talked about social learning, and we talked about all these other things. But they also weren't getting so much stickiness because people weren't listening to it. That's not where they were. And then as people, I talked about this on the freemium, it's actually educating people. That's a big part of freemium. So as people were going away from getting a free clicker instead of the paid clicker that was very expensive and response system that was very expensive, they slowly also listened more into this other opportunity, this other stuff. And when we were speaking to investors, we did actually a lot about the value stuff because we talked about where the product would flex into. And that's actually one of the hurts that I realized. I wasn't very good at explaining what I was saying in the press was very value driven, that maybe my investors thought we were only talking about values and not product. So it was a shift in terms of communicating, actually getting very good at communicating at different levels and choosing what to say when is important. But all the things Tom was talking about, you have to do them all. You just have to know when to say what and when people are ready to listen to you.
Great. And there's I'm gonna sort of shoehorn in one final question, which is for both of us. I'll let you start, or rather, I'll start and I'll let you finish. So, what are the biggest opportunities in EdTech now? It's difficult to say. We've alluded to some of them in the funding report. The one that I'm particularly passionate about is, there's a few ways of looking at distance learning or home learning. One of the things that the very tragic pandemic has done is it's meant that many children aren't able to access the full breadth of their educational experience. Obviously, as investors in EdTech, we believe in the value of software to help children and everyone learn, but we also recognize the value of being in a classroom with other human beings, right? And that's extremely important for social development and emotional development. And it's also important for aspects of pedagogy. So I think that what's going to be interesting is to see which companies try to address really the damage that's been done to children's educations of this, what will soon be almost 18 months of disruption. And I think that parents will be very interested in those solutions because children will need to play catch up. They'll have to go back to school and they'll have to start where they were about to be without having had all those months in school. So I think that any tools that help people address the gaps that have been created by this crisis are going to be interesting to look at, both from a funding perspective, but also, just from a creative perspective to see what solutions people come up with. I'll hand it over to you, Johan.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think a lot of to address Steinar here, not necessarily from a user perspective. A lot of things that's important is Kahoot was set up the global classroom before the pandemic. So one of my inclusive design proposals was that people who are stuck at home could take part in at least a Kahoot because they could dial from home, or you could connect classes together. Then all of a sudden, everyone is at home. So Kahoot was, because of an early decision in the company's path, was was setting us up for being relevant for that. And I think more companies now, when we're looking at it, people need to have an inclusive design approach, because you never know what's going to happen. Lockdowns, other things. So actually, those who are rising up now are tools like Zoom and others, right? Because they address the problem. But what they don't address, we are looking at, is companies who are addressing the feeling of belonging to something. So one of the reasons that takes students through class is that they do, they have events together, they are putting on plays, they're doing all these things. They don't exist anymore. You don't have a community with your co-learners that are driving you forward. A big part of the reason we did Kahoot in Classroom is that the learning value is in actually what happens between you, the social learning in between the students live. That's why we have to look up and you look at the screens of the teacher. So people who are addressing not just the delivery of content and all the stuff that teacher wants to race through. We know from studies that students are falling asleep at home with Teams. Nobody knows, right? They're turning off the camera. So a big opportunity now, if you get it, and this won't go away, by the way, I think this will continue, because we'll get more and more digital learning, is actually addressing the sense of belonging and social learning. And it's the same for companies, because they're already decentralized, like HP, who has 400,000 employees and they're spread over the world. One of their biggest problems is feeling of community, getting clicks for driving forward, mentorship, asking questions, all these things. So call it back channel opportunities, kind of the Slacks of education, all these things are going to be huge opportunities for people to address. And that's kind of my point earlier, is like having the counterintuitive. I think the big ones are going to have a counterintuitive approach, addressing human feelings, because education for students, what you're missing out on is the human part. The content is there.
That's great, and I think that's a wonderful place to end. So I want to thank you very much. I think from everyone in the audience, I'm sure, Johan, for your time today, and thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you for your wonderful questions as well. Obviously, we will also have some of this content available to consume later for those who haven't been able to attend today. I'm going to hand over to Hege to close, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you, Johan, for sharing and paying it forward, as you always do. And with that, also want to thank the audience, of course. And with this, we've now finally launched our Brighteye European Virtual Tour for now, and we're super excited and looking forward to doing more or less monthly events similar to this, where we discuss different types of challenges and experiences connected to growing an EdTech company. So the next stop is planned for France on the 24th of February. More details to come, so make sure that you follow Brighteye on LinkedIn and kind of reach out, catch up with us when you want, and we will make sure that we share more details and hopefully see you all next month. So thank you very much, everyone.
Bye.